In just a moment here. All right, we are live on YouTube. Welcome everyone. This is Christians and Pagans, a history with Catherine Carr. And I will go ahead and turn over the mic to you.
All right. Was my audio and video good, just to check? Wonderful, wonderful. All right, well, welcome everyone. I wanted to do this talk because I actually gave a similar talk a few years ago, and I've learned even more about the subject since then. I'm someone who was raised Catholic, and I studied a lot of Christian theology as a Catholic. Obviously, that is not where I ended up, and I've studied a lot of pagan theology since becoming a pagan. And I've also studied some political science. That was my minor in university, and noticed some really interesting things that I want to talk about because there are a lot of religious narratives about how different theologies lead to different consequences. And one of the things that I think we often underappreciate is how theologies can change for political reasons. So what I really want to focus on today is the ways in which Christianity has actually changed since its early days, and the ways that we can guard against our own religions going the same way, because just because we have certain theological tenets now doesn't necessarily mean that pagan groups are not capable of encountering certain problems that Christianity has. So I'm going to attempt to screen share. The technology sprites have been odd with me this week, so please let me know if you can see this all right in just a minute. All right. Are folks able to see before I go into presenter mode? Is PowerPoint showing up all right? Wonderful. Wonderful. And yes, as Nina said, we'll be taking questions periodically, and really at any time. If you have a burning question, you're welcome to type it into the chat. And let's get a prettier view going here. That's not exactly what I want. Look, they've moved the controls around again.
I think if you click view, maybe?
View. Let's try this. We've got full screen, present, it's at the very top there. Thank you.
No problem.
All right. So the question is, why are we here? This is a longish, rather academic topic for a pagan conference, but I wanted to talk about it so that we can really learn the roots of religious intolerance and persecution, because they're not just theological as the narrative sometimes goes. Theologies can actually be changed by political motives, and I think that's really important to keep in mind. I hope we can repeat the mistakes of the past as we're, growing as a religious movement. And another thing that drove me to want to make this presentation is that I've seen a lot of people identifying as Christo-pagan in some of my Christian circles lately, and they are not necessarily being well received by either the Christians or the pagans. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how working with Jesus in a pagan context is actually not that odd historically, and there's no real reason why working with Jesus necessitates having some of the more problematic teachings that we see in a lot of modern Christian churches. Anyone have any questions about that so far? Comments? All righty. So I want to talk about how paganism evolved, because there is this narrative that I think is increasingly being challenged in pagan communities, but this idea that everything was great when everybody was pagan, and that paganism was never imperial, essentially. And there's also this narrative that Christianity and Abrahamic theology has always been super imperialist and intolerant, which isn't as true as some of the popular pagan narratives go. And I want to talk about how the theologies, what the differences really are, and what has kind of driven the differences in how they manifest today. We're going to focus in Europe and the Middle East, mostly because those are areas I know about, but also because one interesting conversation I see in pagan spaces is that some people like to include African traditions and indigenous American traditions, indigenous Asian traditions under the pagan umbrella, which I think is great if they want to be there, but a lot of those traditions actually don't want to be classified as pagan because it's a European word that's still considered very negative in heavily Christianized areas of the world. So I always like to be mindful of that because I'm happy to have those traditions here if they want to be, but I've heard a lot of conversations about, please don't refer to us as pagan because that has a lot of historical connotations. And one thing that is important to keep in mind, I think, is that Christianity covers maybe 1% to 2% of biological human history. 90% of human history was the Stone Age, when basically everyone was hunter-gatherers. And from what we know, that includes a lot of religious elements that we would think of as pagan. We have a lot of evidence for animism, what I'm calling psychopomps, because shamanism is kind of a culturally specific term, and pantheism, which is another common pagan view. So there is some truth to the idea that before Abrahamic monotheism and Christianity, everybody was pagan for most of human history. But that doesn't necessarily mean that everything was a, amazing feminist utopia. Hunter-gatherer morality is very interesting because I'm citing Flannery and Marcus here, The Creation of Inequality, which is a very, very big, somewhat dry, but very exhaustive review of evidence that we have both about ancient civilizations from archaeology and about some indigenous civilizations that haven't been totally influenced by, our global culture yet. And what we see is that hunter-gatherers tend to view hoarding and ego as some of the worst vices, which is kind of the reverse of modern society, right? But it turns out that cooperation and sharing are actually the most important things for human survival strategies. It turns out that the strategies our ancestors use to gather food actually won't work unless everybody shares, because you're not going to eat a whole wildebeest, and so there's not a lot of point in even engaging in large-scale hunting unless you're going to share. The gender politics of hunter-gatherer societies also tend to be on the egalitarian side. There can be a little bit of patriarchy that creeps in with men kind of monopolizing religious practices at the time, but women supply most of the calories people eat, and violence is generally frowned upon. So tend to be more egalitarian gender politics, more liberal sexual ethos. We also find a lot of hunter-gatherer societies that actually not only recognize but honor intersex people and more than two genders because they don't have a lot of, invested interest in indoctrination, and they recognize that these people exist. And they're often actually considered especially gifted because the idea is that the divine clearly covers more than one gender. And so if you're someone that kind of covers both or is in between or is an unusual gender, then you have a more divine perspective in some ways because you're not kind of limited to the gender binary. And obviously hunter-gatherers have to be very up on ecology. They have to be in right relationship with all the living beings around them in order to survive. So those are some things I think that are nice about hunter-gatherer morality that we start to see then getting a little bit replaced when we get monocrop agriculture. Any questions so far? Comments, concerns? All righty. So monocrop agriculture, I'm not saying just agriculture, because we actually now know that hunter-gatherers very intensively cultivate their surroundings to maximize productivity, but they do that in this more labor-intensive, less mass production kind of way that turns out to actually be more nutritionally balanced and more stable against famines than monocrop agriculture. But monocrop agriculture has the advantage that it's easier. You take one crop that has a huge caloric output, you grow nothing but that, you end up with a bunch of calories. You also end up with a bunch of nutritional deficiencies, but short-term benefit, lots of calories. And that unfortunately incentivizes a lot of bad behavior, because at that point you have resources that you can hoard. You're producing more food than you need, so much so that you can actually hoard huge amounts of food and benefit from not sharing with others. You want to compete over the most productive areas of land for that crop now, which means that you can directly benefit from taking your neighbor's land, which isn't much of a thing for hunter-gatherers because of the way they interact with their land. And the result is that patriarchy happens, because there is incentive to pressure women to produce as many babies as possible and to condition the men to do violence. So the idea that the value of masculinity is in the ability to do violence and procure land or whatever your local unit of wealth is, that benefits the elites of the society, because then they're getting people to go against our natural instincts and basically treating people as objects that are, derive their value from their ability to produce food and wealth and all these other things. And this is not related to monotheism. So this we actually see popping up in pagan empires. After they've done a lot of monocrop agriculture, they tend to be reasonably patriarchal. Merlin Stone's great book, When God Was a Woman, covers some really great evidence about how goddesses were given sometimes the highest status in some of the ancient pagan pantheons, and how women had more economic freedom and more active roles in religious life. But one thing she doesn't mention is that there were no female Sumerian rulers that I'm aware of. There were definitely things that women were not expected to do nearly as much as men, if at all. And that's because we already had patriarchy going here. We already had a paradigm where men can conquer other lands, and women, they mostly want to create as many soldiers as possible. So the Abrahamic faiths did not invent patriarchy. It's popular to some of the beliefs. Now, they did come out of patriarchies, because it was into these already kind of patriarchal societies that were polytheist and pagan and still honoring earth goddesses, but also engaging in a lot of warfare and patriarchy. It was into these societies that the Abrahamic faiths popped up. There are actually two different origin stories of the first monotheists, which is interesting to me, because there's the story of Abraham actually being born in the Sumerian and then Babylonian city of Ur and walking away from Babylonian polytheism in favor of monotheism. And then there's also a lot of evidence that the people who would become the Jews and set the stage for monotheism started out as Canaanite polytheists who developed a devotion to one particular Canaanite deity. But one thing that's kind of interesting, I have not been able to find any other instances of legit monotheism other than the Abrahamic faith, which is very weird. I had been told many times that there were all of these other instances in other empires and Zoroastrianism, for example, but every time I've looked into one of those religions, I've ended up having the followers tell me, it's really not useful to think of us as monotheists because we are monists, but that is very different and has very different moral implications. So monism is the idea that everything comes from a single unified divine source. it's kind of like a single creator, except that monists don't tend to anthropomorphize that source. They don't tend to attribute anger or jealousy or control issues to that source. If anything, they tend to think that, everything in creation is in some way a manifestation of that source, including all of the diversity we see and many different ways of being. And you find this view, I just wanted to give some examples because it's actually very widespread in the pre-monotheist world. There are good arguments made by more knowledgeable people than me that this is the view of the Aztecs, the Taoists, Hindus. There is some evidence to suggest that Hellenic pagans and heathens at least sometimes held this view as well. So they are, from a certain perspective, coming at a unified creator type of situation. But the gods are not the ultimate source. They are created beings that express different aspects of the source, because you can't have, infinity expressed in anything that's remotely recognizable as a anthropomorphic human-like personality. Anyone have any questions about that? Because it's an important distinction, but it's not one I hear talked about a lot. All right. And so monotheism seems to happen when people conflate one particular deity with the source of all creation. It happens when we've got people who are saying, there is, the progression seems to be for the followers of Yahweh, this is our personal God, which is very, very common and fine thing that polytheists do, to our God is the best God, which is getting a little theologically dicey in my opinion. And then our God is the only God and is actually the same as this universal source. And this turns out to be really, really good for imperialism, because then you only have one source of authority. You only have one right way to do things, and you only have one source of divine authority. So there is allegedly, in theory, little room for argument about who the ruler who has divine right is. And here's some of the moral differences we see between monotheism, where there's only one God, and this is an anthropomorphic God who is also the creator, and monism, where you have a unified creative source, but it's not an anthropomorphic God. You see, in monism, there's more openness to divinity as infinite nature, different natural forms being expressions of God, whereas in monotheism, God is a very, well, I'll put it this way, an entity who shares a lot of human opinions, and things that are not human are not considered as divine or as important, and things that humans do that the author of certain scriptures don't like are not considered great. There's also Monica Zhu in The Great Cosmic Mother has pointed out that there is a difference between a relationship of humans to being of the same source and substance as divinity versus humans as made objects, clay in the hand of the potter. A pot is a tool. It is not a family member. It is not a living being. It is a tool that is made for a specific purpose. And so when we go to monotheism, we tend to have this divide where God is divine, this one particular God, but nothing else is. If this one particular God is the only God, then nothing else can be God or have God, because that is actually considered blasphemous in monotheism. And that causes a lot of problems, because we stop thinking of the world as alive, we stop thinking of it as having inherent value, and we stop thinking that way about our fellow humans as well. So very, very useful for imperialism and patriarchy, because it removes any necessity to kind of put the brakes on to recognize value in anything other than this single God who is separate from the world, but not great for human experience in a lot of ways. Now, one interesting controversial question I wanted to raise is, was Jesus Christ a monist who believed that there is a single, divine source or Father, but everything is an expression of that source? Or was he a monotheist who believed that nothing was divine outside of this one particular God? And obviously, the modern churches teach that Jesus was a monotheist who came directly from Jewish theology, which may have been the case. It's actually really hard to pin down historically whether Jesus even existed, or his relationship to, there's obviously some relationship to Judaism, but how in line it was with the form that monotheism has taken today is really in question. So Jesus pointedly stated that God lived in all people. Those are some of his most famous words. The Christ in all people, whatever you do to anyone, you do to me, etc., etc. He pointedly ignored religious authorities and laws in favor of treating everyone as equal and having divine worth. Actually, like most of his ministry was specifically breaking religious laws in favor of treating other beings as having inherent worth. He pointedly criticized religious conformity as being kind of unimportant to one's actual relationship with the divine. And he was also anti-imperialist. The big thing that ended up causing problems for Christians with the Roman pagans was that Jesus and his followers would not give any divine right to rule to the Roman Empire. And that turned out to have a lot of implications for the Roman Empire at that time. And early Christian Gnostics, I like to think of as a little bit of an example of early Christo-pagans because they had some arguably borderline polytheist views, definitely some pantheist views, but they followed Christ. And some of them actually believed that the Yahweh of the Old Testament was not the true God, but was sort of an imposter in a polytheist sort of sense. Do we have any questions, comments, concerns? All right. And this gave early Christianity a complicated relationship with patriarchy and imperialism because it was unquestionable at the time that what was being pushed as the Jewish monotheist orthodoxy was extremely patriarchal. Now, one thing that's interesting is that Judaism as we know it also kind of didn't exist at this time. The Sadducees and the Pharisees who are mentioned in the Bible, I think many people think of them as being sort of like a bicameral legislature of Judaism, but actually they were competing factions that were competing to say this is what Judaism is to be. And so Jesus was using some of the same scriptures as them in his work, apparently, but clearly disagreed with them about what this tradition was supposed to look like and what a proper morality looked like. So we've got this complicated situation where Jesus and his early followers are drawing heavily on these arguably very monotheistic and patriarchal texts, but Jesus's actual ministry is, if anything, kind of the reverse of that. And empire is gonna empire. So the Roman Empire became concerned about early Christians because they denied the divine right of the emperor to rule. And the problem with that was the empire didn't actually have enough troops to police all its occupied provinces at that point. So the main thing stopping people from rebelling was A, belief in the divine right of the emperor to rule, and B, fear that if you did anything to challenge the emperor, you would be immediately obliterated. So this led to the Roman pagans deciding to execute all of the Christians who publicly denied the divinity of the emperor in the most horrible ways possible. And I've cited Elaine Pagels there. Her book, The Gnostic Gospels, is a short read, very, very informative and fascinating read, where she actually lays out a lot of correspondence, both between Roman officials being like, do we really have to execute these Christians? Like, they seem pretty harmless. And then Rome being like, yes, absolutely, because if you don't, all of those militants are going to start revolting. And also between early Christian theologians, while they were hashing out some of the differences between early Christianity and what would become imperial Christianity. Any questions there so far? All right. So this is a great example. The Roman pagan treatment of Christians is a great example of the real roots of religious violence, which you can't cause religious violence, in my opinion, purely through theology. You've got to have some kind of material motive. And you also can't protect against religious violence purely through theology, because when material motives get in the way, abstract ideologies tend to go out the window. So the Romans feared loss of material resources and forced labor from their occupied territories. So even though they were theologically pretty religiously tolerant, they were like, we have to violently suppress any theologies that are potentially going to mess with our material situation here. And this was the exact same logic that's used in future Christian holy wars, where in theory there's a theological motive, but actually it's we just want to conquer you and we need a way to morally justify this. So Christianity spread very quickly in the early Roman Empire for obvious reasons. The Roman Empire was kind of patriarchal. It was a very stratified, class-ridden society. They did practice slavery, and along comes this Christian religion that basically says there is no difference between a slave and a noble person in the eyes of God. There are passages in the Bible before the Paul's misogyny started, basically saying there's no difference in the eyes of God in the value or power of men versus women. Really, all you need to do is like feed the poor and heal the sick, and just ignore all of this other classist and materialist stuff that's going on. So that became very, very popular, both because I think people realized at some level that it was inherently true, and because it was especially appealing to the lower classes who were the vast majority of the Roman population at that time. At some point, the Roman government realizes, you know what? We're going to have a better time if we decide that our emperor is the chosen of the Christian God, instead of trying to continue to fight this Christianity that the lower classes really love. But there's some problems, because obviously we can't embrace all of these egalitarian and anti-classist and anti-materialist teachings, so we got to make some changes here. And at this time, Christianity actually looked a lot like paganism today, in that there wasn't a central authority, there wasn't a central set of scriptural guidebooks. There were a bunch of different books written by a bunch of different teachers circulating, and a bunch of different local theologies based on the UPG of the people in local congregations. So there were basically a lot of Christianities, and the state obviously couldn't have that. So they get together a bunch of Christian leaders and basically say, we're going to decide what the official teachings of Christianity are. And bonus points to anyone who makes it super patriarchal and imperialist and includes the idea of divine right to rule in, their formulation of Christianity. This is also where we see one of the teachings that Christianity did sort of already have at that point, but that was really changed to make it useful for mass control, was the idea of salvation, the idea that you can go to heaven or join with God by believing the right things and doing the right thing. And that was very useful because that was not a concept that paganism typically had in the same way. And you could basically use that to get people to do anything. You can use that to get people to rely very heavily on a centralized authority, which the imperial Christians ultimately did. You can use that to convince people that you're actually doing people a favor when you genocide them, because otherwise they wouldn't be able to go to heaven, all of these things. So there were things about Christianity that made it already appealing to the Romans, but they really had to do something about some of the radical egalitarian teachings Christianity had at the time. So the Roman state is now Christian, and they start persecuting the pagans in exactly the same way they persecuted the early Christians. And they're also persecuting any Christians who are seen as heretics. Women who led Christian congregations had an especially bad time. One of the reasons we actually know a lot of the things that are in Elaine Pagel's Gnostic Gospels book is that the Gnostics knew that their texts were going to get burned and they were going to get potentially executed, at the very least legally punished. So they would put their texts in jars and bury them in the desert and just hope, when it's safe or at some point in future posterity, people will find these again and these texts will be preserved. So it was not a good time for either Roman pagans who still believed in and wanted to work with the old gods, or for Christians who refused to go along with the imperialization of their religion, or for that matter, for Jews who refused to convert to Christianity, because at this point, divine right of the emperor is conflated with the specific chosenness of the emperor by Jesus. And unfortunately, the Library of Alexandria was a casualty. It was a casualty of this paranoia that, oh my gosh, pagans are bad and immoral, and we have to destroy anything that has incorrect theology, which included, most science and scholarship, as it usually does when these kinds of crackdowns happen. Any questions so far? All right. And I do want to say a word about eating babies. So one thing that comes up again and again in this story is that everyone accuses their political and religious enemies of killing babies. Everyone, without exception. The Jews accused the Canaanite pagans of that when they wanted to conquer them. The Romans said it about Christians when Christianity was this scary new monotheist cult. The Romans and Christians both said it about Jews. Christians still say this about pagans. Satanic panic is still going on, and they're still saying, oh gosh, they sacrifice babies. If someone and conspiracy theorists, of course, QAnon, Pizzagate, Illuminati, literally all of those involve our political and or religious enemies kill babies for no reason. If anyone ever tells you that their opposition is killing babies for no reason, I recommend that you both assume they are lying to you about that and probably other things, and then ask what they're trying to distract you from. Because humans don't tend to kill human babies for no reason, but it's a really useful way to justify advocating violence against full-grown adults if you're claiming that you're protecting babies. So that anytime someone says, well, my opposition eats babies, I'm like, what are you hiding? Because this has been done so many times. And of course, we have some modern examples of satanic panic, which I was reading one of the FBI reports on satanic panic recently, and it's amazing because what essentially happened is that, almost everyone in the United States believed that there were satanic and pagan cults that were murdering children by the tens of thousands. There was never any evidence for this. And the reason the FBI eventually started discouraging it was that it got to the point that law enforcement officers were often paying more attention to trying to root out satanic religions than to actually stopping crimes and collecting evidence against crimes. So maybe they would go into the suspect's house and they would take their heavy metal CDs, but they would forget to look for weapons. It was really bad. So the FBI was eventually stop this. There's no evidence that it's happening, and it's actually hurting prosecution of real crimes at this point. But even a couple decades ago, I know someone who a bookstore she knew was raided because they were selling pagan literature, and the law enforcement was like, oh, maybe it's a satanic cult location. And they're like, really? Honestly, the whole abortion Holocaust narrative that's used by the right, and especially by conservative churches, also falls into this. The thing that really gets me about that is that these are usually the same leaders who are driving up abortion rates because they want to stop people from getting sex education or contraception. But it's the exact same thing. Our political opposition loves murdering babies. Therefore, literally no matter what we do, you have to side with us because babies. And it's also showing up in QAnon, Pizzagate, Illuminati theories, etc. Yeah, it's very weird. I guess it's always been very weird. I just wasn't aware enough during the satanic panic years, but I'm like, man, you people are believing some weird stuff. So the Roman Empire now has an interesting task, which is it has to take this empire that was previously polytheist and kind of diverse polytheist too, actually, because the Roman approach was, okay, fine, we'll add your gods to our pantheon, and as long as you don't try to suggest that your gods are against our emperor, you're probably good. And now they're trying to do this monotheism thing where there's only one divine authority, there's only one right way to do things, and there's only one legitimate empire because there's only one God. And so how do you do that? One way that they did it was the doctrine of divine right, which was the same thing the Romans were doing, exact same thing, continuation of it really, where they promise to spread Christianity and privilege Christian leaders and Christian places of worship and all of these things, as long as the Christian leaders support the idea that the ruling imperial and later national royal authorities are divinely ordained by God to rule, and basically that pleasing God means pleasing your local warlord. And obviously a lot of Christian leaders took this deal. Excuse me, gracious. And a lot of previously non-Christian leaders were like, you know what? Yeah, I can see how this monotheism thing would be useful. So the conversion of the rulers was actually not very difficult in many cases because there were a lot of material reasons to do this. Another thing they invented was the doctrine of demonism, which again, some Christian churches will use today, which teaches that there's only one God and his angels, and then there are harmful, malicious demons whose entire motive is to harm God's creation. And since there's only God and his angels and then demons, any spirit that is not God or one of his angels must, by theological necessity, be a demon. Any god, any ancestor, land spirit, doesn't matter, definitely a demon. And that allowed them to do a lot of fear mongering. It's actually the root of the idea that pagans worship the devil, because if there's nothing except, God and the devil, then obviously anything that isn't Christian or at least Abrahamic is literally devil worship. So that served them very well because they could inspire a lot of paranoia by saying, hey, your neighbors who worship this old god or talk ancestor spirits or land spirits or whatever, actually consorting with demons who want to kill you. So that worked in their favor. And the doctrine of salvation, which, interesting point, there is no hell in the Old Testament or in Judaism. Not a thing. A new invention as of Christianity, maybe might have been some Zoroastrian influence there, but we're not sure. So the idea of salvation literally justifies anything, because anything is better than eternal torture, very much including temporary torture and murder. So if you do those things in the course of trying to save souls from hell, you're still doing them a favor. And that is really great if you want to just conquer the heck out of the entire world. Any questions or comments so far? All right. And by the 1200s, indigenous and polytheist religions had basically stopped being an important influence in Europe. There was a lot of conversion by the sword under Charlemagne, and there was a lot of general trade coercion, where obviously if you wanted a military alliance or a trade alliance with favorable terms, you kind of had to be Christian if you wanted to do business with any of the parts of the former Roman Empire. So by this point, all of Europe was Christianized, but the problem was rulers still wanted to fight over power, and using theological justifications was still really convenient. So the fight between different versions of Christianity steps up. And we actually get the Inquisition founded in the 1200s, which has the job of rooting out absolutely any deviation from the official state-approved religion, which was some variation on Catholicism for basically all of Europe at this point. So some of the things that they literally had like riots and executions about were such hilariously small theological points that I cannot find any way in which they would have a practical effect on daily life. But enforcing the ideological uniformity meant enforcing uniformity in submission to the rulers. One major casualty of this was the Cathars, who they were actually surviving Gnostics. They did not believe that organized churches were necessary for salvation. They were actually known as the good men, and there were also women because they were, like the Gnostics, more gender egalitarian. And they basically believed that if you just lived simply, prayed a lot, helped people, that was how you got to heaven and communed with God. The Inquisition at one point exterminated an entire town because they knew Cathars had been evangelizing there and they couldn't figure out which residents were Cathars and which weren't. So they were very serious about this idea that any kind of heresy potentially led to hell and also rebellion against the state. Jews were also excellent scapegoats, just like today, where we've got our marginalized people being blamed for all of the things that the right-wing government is actually doing. Same thing was happening there. Excellent scapegoat, get people to ignore what the rulers are actually doing and focus on people who really didn't have the ability to fight back or cause a real problem for the state. And this was to the point that a lot of European Jewish families have fake pork recipes that have been passed down, because one thing that would make people suspect that you were Jewish was if you were eating pork. And so to avoid getting inquisited, they would make dishes that looked just like pork chop, so people could see them publicly eating pork and then not suspect them of being Jewish. It was really bad. And of course, we also have witch hunts, which basically anyone who might cause problems for the imperialist patriarchy if they didn't live in constant fear were getting witch hunted. Mostly women, nonconformists of any type, religious minorities. There's actually not a lot of evidence that a lot of witches were surviving polytheists, but folk magic users were certainly targeted, and pretty much anyone who didn't conform to the mainstream, whatever that town was doing. And the witch hunts get really bizarre because in 1486, Malleus Maleficarum, the Hammer of Witches, was published. Now, what a lot of people still to this day don't know about this book is that its author was literally a psycho stalker. He was once banished by a bishop because he was accusing a woman of witchcraft, and he started describing graphically in court all of these sex acts that he thought she had performed with the devil. And the bishop was like, "You are clearly way too into this, and I'm pretty sure none of that happened. So she's fine, but you need to leave the city immediately." But this wasn't the information age, so most people at the time did not know that. They also did not know that this book was actually condemned by the German Office of the Inquisition. Now take a moment to think about how problematic you have to be condemned by the German Office of the Inquisition. But even they were not into it, and yet the book still circulated with what was a papal bull, effectively a sticker on the front that says, "The Pope says you should read this." Which the author had procured by mentioning the vague concept of a book about hunting witches, and the Pope never actually read what was in it. So this became the second best-selling book in Europe after the Bible for 200 years, and arguably one of the biggest influences on European culture, and arguably still the root of most misconceptions about pagans. And it was, if you're wondering why this became the best-selling book, it was very sexy, it was very violent and scary. It was basically like if the Pope told you, read 50 Shades of Grey and Stephen King, but also as a public safety guide, because stuff is really happening and you absolutely need to murder the people who are doing it. So very, very appealing in terms of the lurid entertainment value, but unfortunately was also being treated as a how-to guide. And one question I want to address was any of this uniquely Christian? Did any of this come uniquely from monotheism? And the answer is a few things helped. Monotheism, the idea of salvation in hell, and demonism certainly didn't hurt in imperialist consolidating power. But Rome and other polytheist empires and even some indigenous societies kind of did some of the same thing. Indigenous and polytheist societies were known to have witch hunts. They still do today. Actually, one controversy that's happening currently in South Africa is that some of the African indigenous people are having problems with magic users who actually do murder people for body parts. And the Wiccans are objecting to these people being called witches because that reflects poorly on Wicca, but that's a very interesting situation because it's a case where there actually is a problem with witches harming people, and there is an indigenous society engaging in witch hunts, and nothing to do with monotheism there, no monotheist influence. Oh, pardon the typos, my keyboard has been on the fritz this week. So, was this actually caused by Christian monotheist theology? Not necessarily. A lot of this are things that any theology can be prone to, but again, those doctrines certainly helped with the imperialism. And I want to take a moment here to discuss how to avoid a witch hunt, because there are things that have been happening both in pagan communities and secular communities that I think it's important to address some of these points. If someone is asking you to attack or ostracize someone else because they allegedly did something really bad or they hold the wrong ideology or something, the first thing you want to ask is there evidence for this? And amazingly, that is something that I often see people not doing. There's often this mindset that if an authority figure or someone who is an alleged victim said something, you have to believe them, and it's not right to demand evidence. But because of that, there have been some cases where people who definitely were not guilty of a certain offense kind of had their careers destroyed because people were immediately willing to believe anything bad that anyone said about this person. And that's basically how witch hunts happen. You know, the idea that you have to believe allegations against people without any evidence. It's also useful to ask, could there be another motive for these accusations? Is the accuser in direct competition with the accused for something, which often is the case with witch hunts? And it's also worth asking, is the accused a marginalized person? Because the thing that's weird is that I've noticed even in cases where the alleged offense is bigotry or oppression or abuse, the people who are most successfully getting accused and ostracized because of these accusations are usually marginalized people. You know, I've seen cases where trans women were basically run out of a community under accusations of being transphobic. And meanwhile, in the same community, there are openly transphobic men who are not getting any of this heat. So it's definitely worth looking at, why are people so happy to jump on this particular person, regardless of what the allegations are or what other people in the community might be up to. It's possible they're being targeted because they're part of a marginalized group. That does seem to happen even when the motives are allegedly progressive. Any questions about that? Concerns, anecdotes? Alrighty, check the time. Yep, we are definitely going to have time left over, which might be good for folks who might have a little bit of Zoom exhaustion, because I know that an 8-hour Zoom call is a lot. But we'll have time for discussion if anyone likes. And I do have some more things I can discuss as well, but only if folks are interested, because God knows we need a screen break. So now we are in the final stages of the development of Christian pagan religions, which is global imperialism and global Christianization. And I'm going to talk about Christianization. There are some parallels to some of the things that happened with Islam, but I am not even remotely qualified to talk about that. But just know that they do have some similarities theologically, and I suspect that's why they both are dominating really big swaths of the globe right now. So when we got proof of a commercially viable route from Europe to the Americas, lots of people started pouring into the Americas, trying to conquer them and extract wealth. An interesting fact that I'll discuss since we have a little wiggle room, Some of the conquistadors were actually freelancers, which is super weird to me. Like Hernan Cortez was specifically told at first, do not go to America and try to conquer them because we, the Spanish government, do not have any information about that, and we don't want to start something we can't finish. But he did it anyway because he thought he could get rich. And yeah, that's an interesting thing I don't hear discussed a lot. A lot of freelancers, a lot of private security contractors, who obviously would turn around and pay homage to the queen, but half the time they were there against the queen's wishes. Very interesting stuff. So around the same time, increasingly ambitious technology was causing Europe to begin also colonizing other regions. And by the 1800s, really the only regions of the world that had not been heavily colonized by Europe and Christianized were some parts of Eastern Asia and South Asia, which had sufficient both geographical barriers and technology that the Europeans were like, you know what, it isn't practical for us to just totally supplant all of the local religion here. And of course, the doctrines of divine right to rule and demonism and salvation all made it much easier for European governments to claim the high ground while doing literally anything, as long as they were also paying lip service to spreading Christianity. And to this day, this brings us to the present day, which I'm sure all of us are somewhat familiar with the relations between Christianity and paganism in the modern world. Most, but not all, Christian churches are patriarchal and imperialist. They still target indigenous people around the world for evangelization, and this includes very coercive methods, such as, offering food and housing and education, but only if you at least pretend to convert to and study Christianity. I still don't get how a lot of those organizations don't see a problem with what they're doing, but I guess if you think people are going to go to hell if they don't convert to Christianity, it seems justified. These churches also tend to teach that neo-pagans and polytheists worship devils, harm children, and want to harm Christians. And some of this is, in some churches, it is the literal anything, including like indigenous religions and Buddhism and Hinduism, are devil worship, that version of demonism. And with others, it's just straight up misinformation. Like they think pagans actually worship Satan, but there's no talking them out of it. And unfortunately, that means that most of the Christian churches, according to the data I've seen, do tend to oppose efforts at any form of progressive reform and tend to get co-opted by destructive politicians and dictators who basically want to have a way to have the moral high ground, even while they're full-on genociding people. So the question comes up, and this is something that I hear discussed a lot, actually, is peaceful coexistence with Christians and pagan religions possible? Because there are a lot of churches that will straight up teach that no, it's not. Our job is to turn everyone Christian, which involves eliminating all other religions. So no, we can't peacefully coexist because it's actually in our theology that we're not allowed to do that. So the answer to that question is peaceful coexistence is possible to the extent that churches and Christians are willing to discard some of those teachings. And some churches are doing this. There are progressive Christian churches. To be quite honest, I didn't put a list here because when I was researching them, I was actually finding way more articles from conservative Christian churches about how progressive Christians are not real Christians and are heretics and atheists and all of these things than I was finding actual websites for progressive churches. So that's the takeaway here. Unfortunately, progressive Christians have it rough because which is funny because there's a very good objective historical argument to be made that they are following in Christ's footsteps way, way more than the conservative Christian churches. Literally Jesus' entire ministry was being radically egalitarian and humanitarian and blatantly defying religious law and getting mad at religious authorities. But that's not the Christianity that most Christians are raised with today. And there's a lot of incentive for conservative leaders to turn around and say that if you're a Christian, you have to believe all of these other Old Testament things about, policing people's sex lives and religious conformity and all of that. So unfortunately, Christianity as a whole is still a patriarchal and imperial influence. And we really have the Romans to thank for that, because they're the ones who took this radically egalitarian teaching and decided, you know what, this would be great for conquering people. We have a question in the chat. And what do I feel are the incentives? It really goes back to, scapegoating and justifying, because let's see, am I on the right slide here? There we go. It really goes back to scapegoating and justifying, because the benefit of this combination of super imperialist, super authoritarian teachings with Jesus' work is that you can argue that we have the moral high ground because we're friends with Jesus, literally no matter what you're doing. You can find something in the Old Testament to justify conquering people and genociding people. Interestingly, the ideas of hell and faith-based salvation also aren't even explicitly in the New Testament. They are mostly in theological writings that happened after biblical timeframes. But as long as you've got those teachings, you can morally justify literally anything. You can distract people from material threats that you are posing to their existence by citing spiritual threats that you're claiming other people are posing. You can argue that you're really the good guys because you love Jesus and look how great a guy Jesus was. And a lot of the time there is concrete financial incentives, because rich people really like to use Christianity to get people to like them. And rich people will often give money to any religious leaders that are willing to support them and say they're great people and they agree with their political policies. So there's a very direct, going all the way back to Rome, there's a very direct form of bribery, like, hey, we will give you land and money and tax breaks if you tell people that Christianity means, pleasing us. Yep, exactly. Holy wars are quite profitable. Excellent point, Mina. That is very true. It's also something that I'm like, there's so much happening even domestically in this way that holy wars are quite profitable. They're also just a piece of the massive puzzle of, shall we say, conflicts of interest. And unfortunately, as many of you may have found out from first-hand experience, but I still see this question asked enough that I want to address it. The best option for interactions with conservative Christians as a pagan may be avoidance. This is something that I've encountered in my personal life, and this is for your own peace of mind, which I spelled wrong there, lovely. This isn't like a theological mandate in paganism, it's just life experience, probably going to make your life easier. Unfortunately, it's usually a mistake to expect that you're going to be able to educate conservative Christians about paganism, because their religious leaders are telling them what paganism is. And asking them to believe you over their religious leaders is usually going to be a losing battle. They have often a lot of trust in these leaders about a lot of things in their lives, and so the idea that they would be wrong or lying about something is not something that they're usually going to get to unless they're having an independent religious crisis of their own. It is a better idea to set boundaries, which is, telling people it's inappropriate to demand to talk to you about your religion or to know about it. And one way that I have used to kind of try to get Christians to understand this is, how would you feel if, like, I started trying to convert you to paganism and telling you how wrong Christianity is and accused you of not knowing what Christianity really teaches? Which the number of Christians I know who haven't read the whole Bible is alarming. So unfortunately, usually educating people is not going to work unless they seem genuinely curious, because they have a lot invested in the accuracy of these religious leaders. And it's usually just the best policy to set boundaries and try to put them in your shoes, because the one thing they do know is that no, they would not like it if pagans came up to them and started trying to convert them. And so what does this situation with Christianity being imperial, but paganism also being prone to imperialism mean for pagans? Unfortunately, pagans in majority Christian countries still face a lot of discrimination. That has gotten markedly better in the US in recent decades for reasons that we'll actually discuss on a future slide. But when the population and authorities believe in imperial Christian propaganda, people who are any kind of religious minority, especially pagan and indigenous religions, can be discriminated against in employment, housing, and even child custody if people believe that their beliefs are actually dangerous, and you shouldn't be around people who believe those things. Not long ago, you know, police would raid businesses selling pagan literature, and as I mentioned, it was quite possible for pagan literature and heavy metal CDs to be collected as evidence of satanic crimes, even more enthusiastically than evidence of actual crimes. So some of us are fighting to normalize by openly practicing paganism, while others staying in the broom closet. There's no shame in that, because there are some very concrete risks, and you're probably the best judge of that depending on where you live. Yep. Excellent point, Nina. If you're a person of color, and especially a Black or indigenous person of color, the risk to you is often higher because you're already at more risk of discrimination and mistreatment. And then if you're also pagan, it's like, what do you do? Another interesting thing that I've noticed is that people of color in the US are sometimes more enthusiastically Christian because the churches sometimes were the only community resources they had. I've actually been in San Francisco this week. I have seen 4 street preaching outfits, and none of them have been white, which is very interesting to me. But that's another community thing that a lot of people of color have to contend with. And what does this mean for, you're gonna go slides. What does this mean for Christians? Well, this actually harms Christians a lot too, because the insistence by church leaders that bad things are what real Christians believe means that Christians end up getting negatively stereotyped by non-Christians. It also means that membership in Christian churches is dropping at an astonishing rate in the US and Europe. Since 1990, roughly 1 out of 100 American Christians has stopped identifying as a Christian every year since 1990. The percentage of the US population that identifies as Christian has dropped from 95% to 65%. And what's interesting is that the numbers of people who say they believe in God or gods or a higher power hasn't really changed that much. But the number of people who specifically feel that Christianity is correct about theology has plummeted and is continuing to plummet. In Europe isn't really well, I can't say that because there's a lot of regions of Europe, but parts of Europe are not majority Christian anymore because so many people have become so fed up with churches often voicing anti-science rhetoric and religious intolerance and regressive political activity and all of these things. So this imperialization of Christianity and the sort of failure of Christian churches so far to decolonize themselves and return to what were maybe more original Christian teachings actually means that Christianity is in decline in a huge way, at least in the US and Europe. It's actually still growing in some other regions. And what does this mean for Christo-pagans? Because there are increasingly large numbers of people who are like, well, I both feel connected to Christ and to pagan practices. And as I hope I've communicated a little bit here, that's not actually that strange. A lot of the early Christians did not necessarily look like what we would call modern Christianity. And there have been instances of pagans feeling perfectly good about working with Jesus Christ because he seems like a great guy, and it's totally feasible, especially in polytheism, for anybody to be a prophet or a divine avatar. but who don't espouse the Old Testament. And there's the interesting territory where at least a lot of the sources we have are claiming that Jesus identified the Old Testament as the source for his theology, but we're not even really able to super verify that. So unfortunately, Christo-pagans will not be accepted by most Christian church leaders because they are super into the Old Testament, because it's good for them in terms of the whole conflicts of interest we've mentioned earlier. And unfortunately, Christo-pagans do also sometimes face discrimination in pagan circles because a lot of pagans have had very negative experiences with Christians. And so as soon as they hear someone talking about being a Christo anything, they're like, they have a lot of opinions about that theology and that entity. And I think it's important for us to remember on that note that no theology is immune from imperialism. You know, it's not just caused by specific teachings about a specific type of God. It's ultimately caused by material conflicts of interest and ego. And any theology, I mean, if Jesus's work can be turned into an imperial, authoritarian, class reinforcing theology, anything can be. So I think it's important that we keep an eye on our leaders and also ourselves to see, are we, you know, maybe being a little bit too quick to jump on people who disagree with us? Are there ever places where we financially benefit from that? And that might be a conflict of interest. If someone is proposing that a person or group of people are dangerous, does the proposed action against them, is the benefit going to outweigh the harm? Do they have actual evidence? Is the person who is demanding this a powerful person speaking against a powerless person, or is it the opposite? And there are ways that we can strive in our theology to condemn any kind of persecution or one right wayism, and where we can seek to actually actively value diversity, including ideological diversity, as necessary for the manifestation of the infinite divine. And one thing that I find very interesting is that from a scientific standpoint, there actually is inherent value to diversity of all kinds, genetic diversity, behavioral diversity, cultural diversity, because in any ecosystem, the more approaches to a problem you have available in the population, the less likely everyone is to die of that problem. So there is, it's not just like a feel good, we want to be tolerant thing. There actually is concrete reason to say there are survival advantages to having diversity in your population. So that's helpful to know when we're maybe facing questions of religious or ideological intolerance. And I wanted to, this is going to be a tough slide for some people, but I wanted to address real quick that there have been some cases where modern pagans have behaved in kind of imperialist ways, and just things to kind of watch out for and be aware of. One of those is there is a history of some neo-pagans telling indigenous people and traditional folk practitioners that they're doing it wrong, or that they are being dangerous. Ronald Hutton does a great job of covering how this kind of happened in Britain, where some of the early Wiccans would go to rural British villages and tell them, no, you're doing that folk custom wrong. You know, according to Wicca, it's supposed to be like this, and this is what it means. There's a little bit of that still happening in the Americas. Fortunately, we're starting to get a handle on that, where people would, you know, tell people, indigenous and otherwise, what indigenous theology really means and what indigenous societies were really like. And there's a whole situation in South Africa where you have indigenous peoples who are saying, we have witches that are actually harming people, and Wiccans who are saying you shouldn't call them witches, and this is slander against us because we identify as witches, and therefore you should not be using that word, which is especially interesting given that almost all the South African Wiccans are white, and obviously the people who are actually having problems with witches murdering people are not. Another form of imperialism that we see are people who claim to teach and understand indigenous religions who actually really don't. One of the more alarming revelations in recent years has been that Carlos Castaneda was probably just making stuff up when he talked about his, Yaqui shaman mentor, because a lot of what he talked about actually came from Asian religions, and he didn't show any knowledge whatsoever of local flora or fauna or terminology. There have obviously been a number of people who have claimed that Native American prophecies said certain things that they definitely did not say. And there are, unfortunately, to this day, I have run into more than one white initiated shamans who are either straight up faking their credentials as shamans who have been indigenously initiated, or who, and this is rather disturbing, think they were initiated, but the person who initiated them was themselves lying about their credentials. So that is a real widespread problem. And we've also got not literal witch hunts, but there have been situations, including in pagan communities I'm local to, where people have been accused of bigotry and faced massive backlash with no evidence, sometimes without even specifics of the accusations being given. And this is often coming from a place of trying to protect marginalized people. But when people who are trans women are getting ostracized on grounds of transphobia, there might be a problem with your methodology, And that is something that I have seen happen more than once in communities I've been in, actually. So that's also something to watch out for. And obviously arguing for tolerance for any kind of abuse or harmful teaching for theological reasons is a form of imperialism, because you're saying that my ideology and authority is more important than the actual harm that's being done. So those are some difficult things to think about, but things that I think it's important to keep in mind and keep ourselves and our communities accountable. Any questions or anecdotes to share there? All righty. I want to end this, check the time again, we got plenty of time. I want to end this on a positive note, which is that humanity generally does seem to be trending toward being less violent and more informed and more self-aware as the decades pass. We are dealing with a little fascism spike globally right now, but on the big picture, there actually is less violence, more environmental responsibility, and more tolerance overall than there has been in the past. And some would argue that that might be why we're having a little bit of a fascism spike, because it's sort of the last gasp of people who can't deal with the new reality. And one of my college professors was Ronald Engelhardt. I really love his work. And if you're someone who is interested in nerdy survey research and data collection on questions about culture and values, I really recommend his books. He was one of the founders of the World Values Survey, which is an amazing organization that what it does is they poll tens of thousands of people in every country they can safely get access to about, what do you think about this situation? What would you do in this situation? And from that, the World Values Survey compiles data on how different regions of the world are evolving ideologically. And it's good empirical data because they use good sampling methods and survey design and everything. So what we see in that is that there has been a net rise in what Engelhardt calls secular rational values, which is basically the idea that morality and policy are determined by a rational analysis of what is harmful and what is helpful, instead of based on tradition or scripture and people just telling us this is how it's supposed to be. That has really been on the rise, especially in the US and Europe in recent years. Self-expression values, where we place benefit on people being able to manifest who they are, instead of the alternative there is survival values, where we really play it safe and try not to do anything that could rock the boat or cause changes or trouble. Those are both on the rise. And some say, Engelhardt is actually one of them, say that religion is on the decline globally because of these changes in values. But if you look at people's beliefs and practices, which I've cited the American Religious Identification Survey, which asks more specific questions about people's beliefs and behaviors, what you see is that religion is only on the decline if you define religion as membership in an imperialist religious organization. People who have personal spiritual practices and personal religious experiences often don't identify as being religious because of negative connotations with imperial religions. And globally, indigenous religious revivals and the commonality of personal spiritual practices and personal spiritual experiences are on the rise. And what's interesting about that is there's a good argument to be made that the Abrahamic faiths have been actively suppressing personal spiritual practices and experiences because they don't tolerate any that are not directly in line with their main line. So as soon as, church attendance started to fall in the US in the 60s, personal religious experiences actually started to go up. So I think there's a lot of hope for the future because it seems like as long as we can avoid, total civilization and cultural collapse, humanity in general is being more rational in deciding to, make our decisions based on what is beneficial rather than what is traditional or correct according to some authority figure. We are better at wanting to protect and promote self-expression, which is great for anyone who is a pantheist and does believe that, every manifestation is the divine trying to manifest itself and that that's supposed to be very diverse. So I think we've got a lot of reason to hope for the future, but we do want to watch ourselves because the danger of imperialism does not go away if Abrahamic monotheism declines. Any religion or ideological system faces the same dangers of engaging in witch hunts and inquisitions and all of these things. So I think, yep, and this is our resources section. I have cited a really strange and interesting combination of literature here. If you want to look into any of that, mostly very informative. And yeah, I think that's going to do it for our actual lecture period. Thank you guys so much for showing up. I knew when I proposed this panel that a 90-minute history lecture was probably not going to be people's favorite thing, but I felt like a lot of this stuff needed to be said, and when I tried to make this presentation shorter, I was actually not confident I could fit it in 60 minutes. So thank you guys so much for attending. Is there anything anyone would like to talk about? Well, we've got about 10 minutes until the start of the noon sessions, and we've got a full half hour if anyone wants a screen break before the 12:30 session starts. So. It's great seeing everyone. I hope this was somewhat helpful and interesting. I definitely can tend toward the academic side, but I think there's an important place for that. Oh, we have a chat item. All right, we've got a thank you, and thank you for coming. All right, what do you think, Nina? Do you want to leave things open a little while longer, or do you want to let folks take a screen break?
Sorry, I had everything minimized. I actually have another class to go begin moderating at noon. So
alrighty.
Yeah.
All right, it worked out well then.
Yes. Yeah, beautiful timing. Thank you very much. That was I love the history. I love the anecdotes of yours, and I really love both the reality of the situation and then the sort of hopeful finish.
Yeah. There's a lot of potential as long as we're careful, to make things really great in the future. And if anyone would like these slides, I have these slides and then also an even more exhaustive set of notes. If you'd like to put your email address in the chat box here, I'm happy to send that to anyone who's interested.
Do you have a link that you could share with us potentially?
Let me make one real quick. I'm going to stop my screen sharing and make us a shareable link.
Okay. And feel free to send that to the Puget Sound Pagan Pride email address, and we'll go ahead and share it from there.
Excellent plan. Excellent plan. And thank you, Nina, for moderating, and to Nina and all of the organizers at Puget Sound Pagan Pride for being way more logistically organized than I would have been on my own as far as shooting this. Does anyone want to test that link to verify? It should allow you to see and download